Written in the Stars. Episode 2. Moments of unshared love. Broken hearts. Shattered promises. Just when they thought their love could finally be defined, fate took another twist for them.
The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow across Nia's room. The world outside seemed so still, but inside, her heart was anything but calm. The events of the previous night had shaken her to her core, and now, the silence in her room only seemed to amplify the uncertainty she felt. It was the soft knock on her door that snapped her from her thoughts. She quickly wiped her face, not realizing it had become damp with unshed tears, before calling out, "Come in." Her mother stepped into the room, her smile gentle as she observed her daughter sitting at the edge of the bed. "Good morning, my love," her mother said softly, her accent thick with the comfort of home. "How are you feeling today?" Nia hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of the blanket. "I don't know, Mom. I feel like I've made things harder." Her mother sat down next to her, folding her hands in her lap. "You're only human, my dear. And love isn't easy. It can be messy, confusing, and it can pull you in many directions." Nia let out a small sigh. "I don't know what to do. I care about both of them, and I don't want to hurt anyone. But I can't just choose someone because I feel like I have to. Not when I'm still so unsure." Her mother nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "The heart knows what it wants, Nia. It just doesn't always know when to show it. You've given so much of yourself to others, but remember to give that love back to yourself first. You deserve it." "But how do I even begin to understand what I want?" Nia asked, her voice trembling slightly. "You start by trusting yourself," her mother replied gently. "You already know deep down. You just need to listen." Nia turned to look at her mother, her eyes searching for something, anything, that could guide her through the tangled mess of emotions. Her mother gave a small smile, squeezing her hand. "Don't rush. You have time, my love. When the moment is right, the answer will come." It was an ordinary afternoon when Nia's world was about to be shaken. The house was buzzing with preparations for the arrival of an unexpected guest, a friend of the family who was coming to visit after being away for quite some time. Nia had heard the name before, Hana, a childhood friend of Taehyun's, who had always been close to the family. Nia didn't know much about her, except that she was often mentioned in passing, a friendly acquaintance that seemed to hold no particular significance. But today, things felt different. As Nia was helping prepare lunch, she overheard Mrs. Choi, the matriarch of the house, chatting excitedly with someone on the phone. Yes, of course, Hana. We can't wait to see you again. Taehyun will be thrilled." The mention of Taehyun's name seemed to bring a particular light into Mrs. Choi's voice, one Nia couldn't ignore. Her heart skipped a beat at the sound of it. "Taehyun will be thrilled," she repeated softly to herself. What did that mean? It wasn't long before the doorbell rang, signaling the arrival of their guest. Nia wasn't sure why, but she felt a knot form in her stomach. She glanced toward the entrance, watching as Mrs. Choi warmly greeted the guest at the door. A girl stood there, her smile bright and confident as she stepped inside the house. She was beautiful, tall, with long, flowing hair and a grace that seemed to effortlessly draw attention. She was Hana. Nia couldn't help but feel a sudden rush of unease. Hana had a certain elegance that was impossible to ignore. Her presence seemed to fill the room, and Nia, standing in the kitchen, felt a sudden sense of smallness. As Hana entered, her eyes immediately sought out Taehyun, and the two exchanged a warm greeting. "Taehyun. It's been so long." Hana exclaimed as she hugged him. There was something about the way she spoke his name that made Nia's chest tighten. Was it familiarity? Or something else? Nia watched from the doorway, her heart racing. She couldn't help but feel like a third wheel in this strange dance between the two. She had never thought much about Hana before, but now, seeing their interaction, a strange sense of discomfort started to creep up inside her. Taehyun smiled at Hana, though there was a subtle shift in his expression, something that Nia noticed. There was warmth in his eyes, but something else too. Distance. You've grown even more beautiful, Hana, Taehyun said with a small chuckle. Thanks to your family's hospitality, she replied, her voice full of sweet charm. Nia couldn't help but watch the two of them. As she stood there, her thoughts clouded. It became more apparent that Hana and Taehyun shared a deep bond, one that made Nia feel like an outsider. Yet an unpredicted moment lingered. Later, during dinner, everyone gathered around the table, talking and laughing. The atmosphere was warm, but Nia couldn't shake the discomfort she felt every time her eyes flicked to Hana and Taehyun. Their closeness was undeniable, but what troubled Nia was the way Hana kept leaning in a little too close to Taehyun, her hand resting on his arm as if there was some unspoken connection between them. Nia's heart tightened in her chest as she tried to focus on her food. She tried to push away the nagging feeling that something wasn't right, that her place in this family was somehow being threatened. As the evening went on, things took an unexpected turn. After dinner, the group moved to the living room. Nia was sitting quietly, sipping on a glass of water, when she noticed Taehyun and Hana talking in a corner. It seemed like an ordinary conversation at first, but then something caught Nia's attention. Hana leaned in closer to Taehyun, her lips brushing near his ear as she whispered something that made him stiffen. Nia didn't hear the words, but the sight alone made her stomach churn. And then, in a heartbeat, Hana kissed his cheek. A quick gesture too intimate for someone who was just a childhood friend. He didn't push her away, rather he remained there, like he enjoyed it. That one thought consumed Nia in an instant. It was as though the world around her had disappeared. She could feel the tears stinging her eyes, but she blinked them back. Nia stood up quickly, not thinking, not planning, and hurried out of the living room. She couldn't bear to watch anymore. The pain was overwhelming, and the confusion was unbearable. How could Taehyun let her kiss him like that? How could he act as though it meant nothing? Outside, the cold air hit her face like a slap, but it did nothing to ease the heat that burned in her chest. She walked quickly, almost running, trying to escape the overwhelming feelings that surged through her. She couldn't do this. She couldn't stand the thought of Hana, someone who had so clearly been a part of Taehyun's life for so long, being so close to him. The weight of it felt like a suffocating blanket, and Nia just couldn't breathe. Tears streamed down her face as she tried to make sense of it all. The conversation with Minjun, Taehyun's patience, his kindness, none of it mattered anymore. Not when she saw what she had seen. She didn't know where she was going, but her feet carried her away from the house, toward the quiet park behind the family's home. Before she knew it, she was standing by a bench, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as she tried to steady her breathing. She felt the ache in her chest deepen, the pain of betrayal so sharp that it almost physically hurt. And then, she heard it, the sound of footsteps approaching. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. She could feel him before she even saw him. Nia, wait. Taehyun's voice was filled with panic, his steps hurried and unsure. She didn't respond, though. She couldn't. The tears that had been threatening to fall now spilled freely, her sobs uncontrollable. I saw you, she choked out, her voice breaking. I saw you with her. I saw the kiss. Taehyun's face twisted in confusion. Nia, it wasn't like that. Don't lie. She whirled around, her face flushed with anger and heartbreak. How could you let her do that? How could you let her kiss you like that? After everything we've been through, I thought. But before she could finish, the sound of another voice interrupted them. It was Minjun. He had been standing in the shadows, watching them. His sharp eyes took in the scene, the tears streaming down Nia's face, the look of panic in Taehyun's eyes. Without a word, he walked forward, his movements slow and deliberate. Nia, you need to calm down, he said softly, his voice surprisingly gentle. Without thinking, Nia threw herself into his arms. Minjun's arms. Her body trembling as she let out a broken sob. I don't know what to do, Minjun, she whispered through her tears. I don't know who to trust anymore. I thought I knew how I felt, but now everything is a mess. Minjun's arms tightened around her, his grip steady and comforting. It's okay, he murmured, his voice soft yet firm. I'm here, Nia. You don't have to make a decision right now. Taehyun stood behind them, frozen, his eyes filled with helplessness and regret. Nia, I swear to you, it wasn't like you think, he called out, his voice breaking. But Nia didn't turn back. She didn't want to hear anymore. The heartbreak in her chest was too much to bear. As Minjun held her close, Nia could only feel the weight of her confusion pressing down on her heart, suffocating her. The choice that had once seemed so clear was now lost in the shadows of her own doubts and pain. And in that moment, she wasn't sure if she would ever be able to choose between them. The next day, everything felt surreal to Nia. The weight of the previous night lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. Her mind was still clouded with the images of Hana's kiss, and no matter how many times Taehyun tried to explain, the bitterness clung to her like a shadow. She couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal, even if it wasn't truly Taehyun's fault. Her heart was simply too fragile to bear it all. She barely slept that night, tossing and turning in bed as the conversation replayed in her mind. There was an ache in her chest, a physical pain she couldn't escape. She thought she knew how she felt, how she should feel, but with Minjun's arms around her, with his gentle presence, things felt different. His warmth, his silent support, it comforted her, and yet, it confused her even more. She didn't know what was happening to her heart anymore. The more she tried to understand, the more tangled it became. The following day was a quiet morning. The house seemed quieter than usual. Mrs. Lee was busy in the kitchen, preparing breakfast, while Taehyun remained in his room, giving Nia the space she needed. Minjun, as always, remained a distant figure, neither too distant nor too close, but there was a change in his eyes, a slight tenderness that hadn't been there before. Nia decided to step outside for a while, to clear her head. The sun was still low in the sky, casting a soft glow across the garden. The air was crisp, the kind that made the world feel clean and new. She walked along the path, trying to keep her thoughts from spiraling. But as she reached the edge of the garden, she saw Taehyun sitting alone on a bench, his head tilted back as he stared at the sky. There was an unusual stillness to him, one that seemed to reflect her own inner turmoil. For a long moment, Nia hesitated. She didn't want to face him. Not after everything that had happened. But something pulled her closer, an invisible thread that tied her heart to him. Taehyun. Her voice was soft, barely more than a whisper, but it was enough to draw his attention. He turned to her, his eyes soft and filled with emotion. There was a moment of silence between them, one that stretched out like a lifetime. Nia, he said, standing up. I'm sorry. I never wanted you to feel like that. Please, let me explain. But Nia shook her head, holding up a hand. I don't want to hear it. I saw what I saw. Taehyun's face fell, and the pain in his eyes was enough to make Nia's heart ache. He took a step closer, but she quickly backed away, unable to face him so soon after everything. I know, he said quietly. I know you saw something that hurt you, but I swear, it wasn't what you think. Then what was it, Taehyun? Nia's voice cracked, and she quickly wiped her tears away. How am I supposed to understand? I thought I meant something to you. Taehyun's face twisted in sorrow as he reached out to her, but Nia pulled back, her chest heaving with emotion. I care about you more than anything, Nia, he said, his voice urgent and raw. You mean everything to me. But Hana, she's just... Hana. Nia cut him in, the name leaving a bitter taste on her tongue. I don't understand. You've known her forever, haven't you? Why didn't you tell me about her? Taehyun's expression softened, and he took another step closer, this time slower, more cautious. Because I didn't want to hurt you, he confessed. She's a childhood friend, Nia. Nothing more. She's been in my life since I was a kid, and our families have always planned for us to be together. Nia's eyes widened as his words hit her. Wait, you were supposed to marry her? Taehyun nodded, his gaze intense, but filled with sadness. Our families have always had this agreement. But I never thought it would matter. I never cared about it. And Hana, she knows it. He paused, looking away for a moment before meeting her eyes again. But she's never understood that. She's always tried to push me, and last night, she kissed me to prove something to her family, I guess. Taehyun's words fell heavily in the silence between them. Nia's mind raced to process everything, her chest tightening as she tried to make sense of it. But you didn't want it, Nia whispered, her voice breaking. You didn't want it, right? Taehyun nodded emphatically, his hands clenched by his sides. No. Never. I don't feel that way about her. I only care about you, Nia. Only you. Nia's heart fluttered painfully in her chest, but she couldn't bring herself to say it. The fear, the confusion, the hurt, they all swirled inside her, making her feel small, lost. Then why didn't you stop her? She asked, her voice trembling. Taehyun looked down, his eyes filled with regret. I didn't know how to. I didn't want to hurt her, but I didn't want her to think there was anything between us. But the moment you saw, I know it must have felt like betrayal. Nia stood there, the cool breeze whipping her hair around her face as she struggled to make sense of the emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. It was like being caught between two worlds, the one with Taehyun, who held her heart, and the one with Minjun, who had become her unexpected refuge. Suddenly, she felt overwhelmed by everything. The love, the pain, the confusion. She couldn't stay here any longer. She couldn't hear his voice, couldn't see him, couldn't deal with it all. Without a word, Nia turned and started walking away, her footsteps fast, urgent. But behind her, she heard Taehyun call out to her once more. Nia, please. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. Nia rushed down the path, tears streaming down her face, not caring that she was running away from the one person who had always been there for her. She didn't know where she was going, only that she needed to get away, to clear her mind. But as she turned the corner, her feet faltered. Standing in front of her, unexpectedly, was Minjun. He had been watching from a distance, observing her, but when he saw her in tears, his expression softened. Without saying a word, he opened his arms, and Nia didn't hesitate, she ran straight into them. She clung to him desperately, her sobs racking her body. I don't know what to do anymore, Minjun, she whispered between breaths. I don't know what I'm supposed to feel. I don't know who I am in all of this. Minjun held her tightly, his arms around her strong and secure, as if offering the stability she needed. It's okay, Nia, he murmured, his voice deep and calm. You don't have to know everything right now. You don't have to have it all figured out. Nia buried her face in his chest, unable to stop the tears that kept flowing. She didn't know how long she stood there, in his arms, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of peace, comfort she hadn't expected. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was a quiet understanding. Minjun didn't need to speak, his presence said it all. He was there for her. And in that moment, Nia realized she wasn't as alone as she had felt. There were choices to be made, and the path wasn't easy, but she wasn't walking it alone. For now, that was enough. Days had passed since Hana's arrival at the Kong residence, and each day felt heavier than the last. The once welcoming and familiar home had become a battleground of emotions, misunderstandings, and silent heartbreaks. Hana, with her overly flirtatious nature, had become a constant presence around Taehyun, pushing herself into his space in ways that felt suffocating to Nia. Despite Taehyun's attempts to maintain distance, Hana's persistence never wavered. She'd laugh at his jokes, make subtle touches that bordered on intimate, and talk to him in a way that seemed to only draw Nia further away. The more it happened, the more Nia shut herself off from him. It wasn't because she didn't care, it was because she was too hurt, too confused. Every time she tried to talk to him, Hana was there, her presence like a shadow over their every interaction. Nia found herself retreating into silence, avoiding both Taehyun and the house at every opportunity. She spent more time in her room, the door always closed, her thoughts too jumbled to make sense of anything. Whenever Taehyun would come looking for her, it was always the same story. Hana would interrupt, or Minjun would step in, making it impossible for Nia to have a moment with him. Taehyun, on the other hand, was slowly sinking into a state of isolation. The once lively and easygoing young man had retreated into himself. He'd barely eat, barely speak, and when he did leave his room, it was only to retreat to the garden or the empty corners of the house, seeking solace in solitude. The weight of the situation, of the distance growing between him and Nia, had crushed his spirit. However, Hana's presence was like a constant reminder of what Taehyun could never seem to have. She saw him as hers, even if he didn't feel the same. She kept pressing herself on him, trying to fit into the spaces where Nia once stood. And it worked. Every time Nia looked at them, she saw how comfortable Hana was in his presence. It made her stomach twist. One evening, as Nia lingered by the door, watching Taehyun and Hana talk in the living room, a mix of frustration and heartbreak boiled within her. Hana was sitting beside him, her arm brushing against his, her laugh filling the room in a way that felt almost too intimate for Nia's liking. Why does she have to do this? Nia whispered to herself, leaning against the door frame, too afraid to walk away. She felt trapped in her own feelings, unable to escape the confusion of watching the one person she loved being slowly taken away by someone else. It was during this time that Minjun began to grow closer to Nia. At first, it was subtle, little gestures here and there, checking in on her, offering her help with anything she needed. But soon, it became harder to ignore. Minjun's presence had a way of drawing Nia in, his calm and steady demeanor in stark contrast to the chaos that had become her emotions. One night, after dinner, they found themselves sitting on the porch together, the warm evening breeze swirling around them. Minjun sat just a little too close for comfort, his leg brushing against hers, his hand lingering a little too long when passing her a glass of water. The way he looked at her was different, more intent, and Nia couldn't ignore it. "Nia, you've been through so much," Minjun said, his voice low and sincere. I just want you to know that I'm here for you, and soon before you realize it, everything will fall in its rightful place, okay? Nia turned to look at him, her heart pounding for reasons she couldn't quite place. The warmth of his gaze felt comforting, but it also felt wrong in a way. He wasn't Taehyun, and she couldn't help but wonder if it was too soon to even consider what Minjun was implying. But then, as if the universe itself had decided to test her resolve, Minjun leaned in. His lips were just inches from hers when she instinctively pulled back, her breath catching in her throat. "No," she whispered softly, eyes wide. "This isn't right, Minjun." Before Minjun could say anything, the door to the living room opened. And there stood Taehyun, his eyes locking on the scene before him. His expression twisted in confusion and pain, his face pale. Nia's heart sank, like something heavy just fell on it, and before she could say anything, Taehyun turned away, retreating down the hallway, disappearing behind his closed door. Nia's stomach churned. She had tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come. She quickly stood up, leaving Minjun behind as she raced down the hall, desperately seeking out Taehyun. The confusion, the heartache, it was all too much. She reached his door, knocking frantically. "Taehyun," she called, her voice cracking. "Please, just let me explain." But there was no response. Only silence. "Taehyun," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She placed her ear against the door, listening for any sound from within. But there was nothing. And then, just as she was about to walk away, she heard it. The faintest sound. The soft, broken sobs coming from inside his room. It shattered Nia's heart into a million pieces. "I'm so sorry," she murmured, her hand on the doorknob, but she knew he wouldn't open it. He was shutting her out, just like he had been shutting everything else out. Nia stood there for a long moment, unsure of what to do. She had tried, but it wasn't enough. She had failed him. "I'm sorry," she whispered again, her voice trembling. "Please, Taehyun." But before she could walk away, the door creaked open just slightly. She looked up in surprise, her heart skipping a beat. There, standing in the doorway, was Taehyun, his face pale and tear-streaked. His eyes were wide with emotion, but there was a wall between them that couldn't be ignored. "Nia," he whispered hoarsely, his voice barely a breath. "I don't know if I can do this anymore. Everything seems to be falling apart more than I'd fear it would. I don't know how to fix what's broken." She stepped forward, her heart aching for him. "Taehyun, please, let me explain. What you saw with Minjun," but before she could finish, Taehyun shook his head, his hands covering his face in frustration. "I know what I saw," he said softly, his voice shaking. I thought you were mine, Nia. But now, I don't know anymore. Did you do this to get back at me because of Hana?" The pain in his voice tore at Nia's soul. She reached out to touch his arm, but he pulled back, taking a step away from her. "Just leave me alone for now," Taehyun murmured, his voice broken. "I can't handle this right now. Please go, Dot." With those words, he slammed the door shut, leaving Nia standing there, feeling more alone than ever. As Nia stood in the hallway, staring at the closed door, the tears that she had been holding back for so long finally started to fall. Her heart ached, not just for herself, but for Taehyun, too. She wanted so desperately to fix everything, to make it right, but the damage felt too deep. Somewhere behind her, Minjun was watching, his eyes softening as he saw Nia's broken expression. But even as he took a step toward her, he could feel the distance between them, the space Taehyun had created, the gap that no one could breach. Nia wiped away her tears, unsure of where to go from here. The story still continues, as greater mysteries unfold. Stay tuned in.